Okay, so chapter 7 took us through a tour of different types of retail locations that are available and why retailers tend to gravitate towards particular locations based on advantages and disadvantages of each type. In chapter 8, we're going to take a much closer look at how retailers choose specific geographic areas in which to locate their stores. And we're also going to talk about the specific site within a geographic area where a retailer would locate. We're going to look at the different factors. We're going to start by looking at the different factors that retailers consider for evaluating general geographic areas. So when you're starting to determine which state or which part of the country to locate in, we start here with some of these bigger factors. And the first is population, the population of an area. So there are many ways to find out what the population of an area or areas would be when you're trying to decide where to locate a retail establishment. So two places I always go, I check the Census Bureau data, which we'll talk about later, and how to access that. And I also look at the Tapestry data, which we talked about in chapter 4. So that has really good estimates of some of that geographic population data. There's another way to look at population, and that is by getting details on either the metropolitan statistical area or the micropolitan statistical area. And an MSA is a city and the surrounding suburbs. It's a group that's put together based on kind of drive time and how long it would take them to get to the nearest city hub. And so if you think about Milledgeville, Georgia, we're actually classified as a micropolitan statistical area because we have over 54,000 people who live within our geographic reach. So understanding the population is the first factor, and the second is understanding economic conditions. It's very important to examine the area's level of employment and the economy and how it's succeeding during a specific period of time. It's also important for the retailer to look back at prior years of employment and future growth predictions for a specific area. Employment means discretionary income, and discretionary income means that people can spend money in a retail establishment. And so that can be a good indicator of the spending power in the area. It's also important to look at competition from a general standpoint first and then a more specific standpoint later. But small towns with limited competition obviously provide quite the opportunity for success. If there's heavy competition in an area, it might be a good deterrent for the retailer to make them locate in a different area so that they have an opportunity for increased sales. When we talk about strategic fit, which is another factor to look at, we're talking about how well the consumers in your target market fit with the people who live in that area. So we're looking to see if the target area has customers that meet our demographic and lifestyle profile that we've identified to purchase our products or services. And the last factor we look at is operating costs. Now, operating costs vary by area, and when we talk about operating costs, we're thinking of rent, advertising, salaries, and other general expenses. And so if you live in a larger area or in a bigger city, you're obviously going to have much higher costs. The sales potential, however, tends to be higher in those areas. So it's one of those trade-offs that retailers have to look at. You also have to look at regulatory environments and costs associated with legal expenses from both the local, state, and federal perspective. Retailers have to abide by certain business laws, and they have to have certain business licenses in order to operate. And so that's the last really factor that varies by area that could impact a decision made by a retailer. So those are the 5 general factors that we look at when evaluating geographic areas. And now we're going to dive into some of the site-specific characteristics that we look at when we're evaluating site locations. So let's narrow this down a little bit. Let's pretend we've identified our area as Milledgeville, Georgia. And so now we're looking at different sites within Milledgeville to determine whether or not we would like to locate our establishment there. There are generally 6 characteristics that we look at. The first 2 are traffic flow and accessibility. So when we talk about traffic flow, we're mainly talking about vehicular traffic, but we're also considering the number of pedestrians that pass by the site. Traffic flow is very important for establishments that anticipate impulse purchases or frequent purchases. Traffic isn't as important when you're talking about specialty retailers or destination type establishments where people are willing to drive to get to you. Traffic flow becomes very important when you're looking at some of those more frequent weekly purchase type of merchandise. There are websites that provide traffic counts for us to look at. And so this is a sample screenshot from the Georgia Department of Transportation that is showing us how many cars drive past each of those blue dots every hour of the day. So those blue dots are traffic cameras that are keeping count of the number of vehicles. And so I pulled up the traffic camera that's located at the intersection right by it's the intersection of 441 and Robertson Mill right by the Milledgeville Mall. And so the last data that they have in there was the 2014 data. But what we can see is this is telling us that on average, every hour of the day, 8,700 cars drive past that traffic light every hour. So what does that mean for us as a retailer? Well, that seems like a lot of cars every hour, but what we have to consider is that this is averaged on a 24-hour timetable. So it is hard to truly count the traffic generated during business hours, but this does get us about as close as we can get. And so obviously if you are in a high traffic area, you have a chance to capture quite a bit of customers. Now, what does this mean from an accessibility perspective, which is really the second characteristic that we look at when determining site location? So it's important to look at the ease of vehicular access to your retail establishment. This is the ease with which customers can get into and out of the site. And so accessibility tends to be greater for sites near major highways and at streets with traffic lights and turn lanes. When you think about street congestion and how hard it is to turn left out of a parking lot that doesn't have a traffic light, even think of some of the entrances for the Milledgeville Mall down by Longhorn Steakhouse or by Starbucks. It can be very difficult to turn left. And so that can actually deter customers from your location because they're not able to access it easily. It's important to also think about the availability of mass transit when we're thinking about access. Especially in larger cities, a lot of people don't use their cars. They do use public transportation. So understanding where the closest bus stop would be to your location is critical in some areas. In addition to thinking about all these accessibility issues, we also have to think about both natural and artificial barriers. I have a funny story about where I'm from, which is a little town in southern Indiana. And my parents and where I grew up is literally off of exit 2 in the state of Indiana. So we are less than 3 miles from the state of Kentucky. But there's a river that separates Kentucky and Indiana, and there's a bridge that goes across that river. And my parents and grandparents are of the mindset that they are not willing to cross the bridge. To them, that is such a big barrier to get to different shopping areas, even though there are many more stores, many more restaurants, higher quality in some cases. The barrier is enough to keep a large percentage of the customer base out of that shopping district. So understanding some of those natural barriers can really play a role in evaluating a site. Same thing with artificial barriers, divided highways, railroad tracks. All of these things can deter customers from entering a retail location. So it's important to look at when choosing a specific site. The next characteristic, the third characteristic that we look at when choosing a retail site is parking. The amount of and the quality of parking should impact the decision. A general rule of thumb, which is kind of fun, it's a ratio based on square footage. And so retailers generally try to get about 5 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet of retail space. So if you are a very small retailer, it's perfectly acceptable to have maybe 2 or 3 or 5, parking spaces outside of your facility. It's not always necessary to locate in a parking lot that has 100 parking spots. Usually, if it is a supermarket or a full-line discount store, that ratio increases to about 15 spaces per 1,000 square foot of space, just because usually more people are frequenting those types of retailers more so than specialty stores or category specialists or convenience stores. But next time you kind of go out looking, observe shopping centers at various times of the day, the week, the year. Look at how many cars are in the parking lot. Look at how big the parking lots are. Look at how traffic flows in those parking lots. All of those can really be important when evaluating different retail sites. Something to remember is you can't forget your employees. So that 5 spaces per 1,000 square foot, that's customer parking. You have to also kind of take into consideration how many employees are going to be in the store at every time and make sure that they have a place to park. So why 5 spaces per 1,000 square feet, right? Why wouldn't we want 100 spaces per 1,000 square feet? Congestion can be a hindrance, right? We never want a customer to not be able to find parking. But too much free parking can also be negative for a retailer. If you've ever driven past a restaurant and there's no one there, or it looks like there's no one there because there's so much parking, that can actually be a turnoff to the customer. And the customer's mind, they're thinking, wow, why doesn't anyone eat there? Why doesn't anyone shop there? It must not be good. I'm not going to go there. So we have to make sure that we're not having too much parking for that. And also parking can be a waste of money, because if you own that parking lot, you're paying for that square footage, and so you don't need a ton of excess space. Next, we're going to look at visibility. So visibility refers to the customer's ability to see your location from the street. Has anybody been to or seen or know where the Firehouse Subs here is in Milledgeville? When we talk about the Firehouse Subs here in Milledgeville, it is barely noticeable from the street. A general rule of thumb, when people are driving and they're driving past your retail location, there's like a 2-second time span that they have to see your location. So if you're trying to attract customers to your location, they need to be able to see it from the street. And so visibility is if you can see the location from the street. It's necessary for new retail establishments, especially retail establishments that are going to require impulse purchases or need impulse purchases to be successful. Adjacent tenants is the other thing to look at when you are choosing a retail site. We call it the principle of cumulative attractiveness, drawing power, that we've already mentioned this semester. Customers like to shop where there are multiple stores. And so if there's a cluster of similar retailing stores that have drawing power, more customers are going to shop there than going to an isolated establishment. So understanding who else is in that shopping center or who else is nearby can be a benefit to the retailer. And the last thing to look at are restrictions and costs. And so there are a lot of zoning laws and legal regulations for each site. Interesting fact, even about Milledgeville, if you know where Stacked Sandwiches is on 441, it's just past the Lowe's. And if you're driving into town, it's on the left. If you're driving out of town, it'll be on your right. And what's the zoning law states, if you've ever seen those like flag banner signs that are outside of retail establishments. On the stacked sandwiches side of the street, those flags aren't allowed per zoning laws. So the restaurants and the stores, it's right next to Chatter Boutique, if you know where that is too. That side of the street, those stores can't put flags or banners on the sidewalk or in the grassy area next to the street. If you cross 441 over to the other side of the street, the zoning laws state that you absolutely can put signs and flags and banners on the grassy area right next to the street. So those restrictions should have an impact in the decision to evaluate site locations because it can make a difference in your day-to-day operations. All right, so those are the 5 factors and 6 characteristics that retail entrepreneurs and retail managers consider when choosing a specific site. And again, I know we walked through that pretty quickly in this lecture, but your book has very great supplemental information for you to look at and can give more examples if you need them for each of these specific characteristics and factors.